Mark sat on the curb, his palms pressed into the concrete. His fingers trembled, a rhythmic vibration he could not quiet. Beside his boot lay the empty needle, its plastic casing catching the harsh morning light. He did not move to pick it up. He simply stared at the gutter as a shadow fell across him. Across the street, his sister walked with her head turned away. She pulled her young son tighter, shortening her stride to keep distance. Her eyes locked on a point somewhere over Mark's shoulder. She did not break her pace. She did not acknowledge his existence. Mark watched her heels strike the pavement until she rounded the corner and disappeared from sight. He remained on the curb, a static figure in a moving world. People navigated around him as if he were a fracture in the sidewalk, something to be stepped over or avoided. He was a ghost in his own neighborhood, a man whose presence was measured only by the debris he left behind. The silence of the street felt absolute, heavy, with the weight of years that had burned away his connections. He leaned his head against the brick wall behind him, closed his eyes, and listened to the distant traffic of a life he no longer touched. The morning sun crawled over the rooftop of the community center, illuminating the alley where the air smelled of stale smoke and damp trash. Mark stood at the mouth of the alley, his boots crunching on loose gravel. He watched 3 teenagers huddled in the shadows. They were hunched over, their heads together, passing a small plastic baggie between them. They did not notice him. Mark did not call out. He did not ask them to stop. He reached into a gym bag, pulled out a beat-up basketball, and stepped into their circle. He bounced the ball against the brick wall. The sound was sharp, a dry thud that bounced back from the concrete. He caught the ball and bounced it again. Thud. He waited for the rebound, caught it, and reset his stance. Thud. The rhythmic pulse filled the narrow space, cutting through the low murmur of the group. The teenagers stopped their movement. The ball stayed in a hand, suspended in midair. One of them shifted, eyes tracking the ball as it traveled from Mark's palm to the wall and back. The silence in the alley changed. It was no longer the silence of secrets, but the silence of an audience waiting for the next beat. Mark bounced the ball again, harder this time, letting the echo rattle the bins nearby. Mark did not look at the baggie. He kept his eyes on the rusted hoop, bolted to the brick wall 10 feet above. He took 2 steps, bent his knees, and rose in a fluid motion. The ball left his fingertips with a soft spin, traced a high arc against the gray sky, and snapped through the net with a clean, metallic ring. The sound echoed down the alley, sharper than the previous thuds. Mark walked to the base of the hoop, reached up, and hooked the ball from the mesh. He turned toward the smallest boy in the group. The boy was leaning against a stack of crates, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. Mark held the ball out. The weight of it hung in the air between them. The boy glanced at his friends, then at the ground, and finally at Mark. He did not move at first. Mark waited, his arms steady, the leather of the ball textured and worn under his grip. The boy stepped forward, reached out, and caught the ball. His fingers fumbled with the surface, then tightened. The tension in the alley broke. The group shifted, their shoulders dropping, their focus narrowing from the small baggie in their hands to the sphere now held by the boy. Mark gestured toward the center of the gravel lot. He stepped back, giving the boy space to breathe, and waited for the first move. Mark did not talk about the past. He talked about the feet. He moved to the smallest boy, placing a hand on his shoulder to guide his stance, showing him how to pivot without crossing his heels. The gravel crunched under their sneakers as they moved in a repeating pattern. He taught them to keep their eyes on the rim, not on the defender. He taught them to block, to shift weight, and to anticipate the bounce. An hour passed in a blur of motion and sweat. Mark watched them, his own breathing deep and measured. He blew a sharp whistle, signaling the end of the final drill. The boys slowed to a halt, hands on their knees, chests heaving. They grabbed their backpacks and turned toward the alley exit. Mark remained by the hoop, his back to the wall. He watched as the group walked past the spot where they had stood earlier. The small plastic baggie still rested on the dirt, covered in a light layer of dust. None of them looked back. None of them reached for it. They stepped over the trash and continued toward the street, their strides synchronized, their attention fixed on the ball, now tucked under the smallest boy's arm. Mark stayed until they were out of sight, then looked down at the discarded baggie, now just another piece of litter on the ground. The next morning, Mark returned to the lot before the sun had cleared the rooftops. He carried a heavy-duty broom and a galvanized metal bin. The ground was littered with shards of broken glass that caught the early light. He swept in long, steady strokes, gathering the debris into piles and hauling them to the curb. He spent hours clearing the perimeter, scraping away layers of grime and neglect until the gravel surface sat flat and clean. By mid-morning, he had dragged a discarded wooden pallet to the edge of the lot to serve as a bench. He returned every dawn, his routine becoming as fixed as the iron hoop on the wall. He spent his mornings sweeping and his evenings coaching as the group grew. He marked the lines of the court with white chalk, tracing the perimeter until the space felt defined and intentional. The lot was no longer a place to hide, it was a place to train. He hauled away rusted scrap metal and stacked loose bricks against the fence to clear the lanes. Each day, the court became more structured. He kept his hands moving, his back straight, and his eyes on the work. By the time the kids arrived in the afternoon, the space was ready. Mark stood at the edge of the court, the basketball firm under his arm, waiting for the first drill to begin. The rhythm of the game was steady until it wasn't. A shadow fell across the chalk-lined court, cutting through the late afternoon glare. Mark paused his count, his eyes snapping toward the perimeter. A man stood at the chain-link fence, his presence heavy and deliberate. He did not speak, but the air in the alley changed. It thickened. The teenagers stopped mid-dribble. The sound of the ball hitting the gravel died out, replaced by the low hum of distant traffic and the sudden, sharp tension of the street. The boys drifted toward the center of the court, their shoulders hunching as they retreated from the fence line. The dealer leaned against the metal pole, his gaze sweeping over the group with a slow, predatory interest. He tapped his fingers against the mesh, a rhythmic, metallic sound that grated against the silence. Mark felt his pulse kick, but he kept his feet planted. He watched the dealer, watched the way the man scanned the kids, and felt the weight of the past trying to pull the ground out from under him. The court, once a place of focus, now felt like a fragile circle drawn in the dirt. The dealer reached into his pocket, his expression hardening into a challenge that hung in the air, waiting for a reaction. Mark did not look at the boys. He did not look at the ground. He kept his eyes locked on the man at the fence. He moved forward, his boots steady on the gravel, closing the distance between the center of the court and the perimeter. He stepped into the narrow gap between the dealer and the nearest boy. The movement was slow, deliberate, and final. He stood there, his chest expanding as he drew a long, measured breath. He did not shout. He did not raise a hand in anger. Instead, he pulled the basketball from his hip and held it firmly against his ribs, his forearm pressed tight across the leather surface. The ball acted as a barrier, a wall of air and rubber between the dealer and the children behind him. The alley went still. The dealer shifted, his weight moving from one foot to the other. But Mark did not yield an inch. He planted his heels, tilted his chin upward, and braced himself. Every muscle in his body was coiled, prepared for impact, yet his face remained blank. He waited. He watched the man scan the court, looking for a way around, looking for a sign of hesitation. Mark offered none. He held his ground, the basketball pressed against him like a shield, forcing the dealer to acknowledge the boundary he had just drawn in the dirt. The dealer's eyes narrowed, scanning Mark's face for a flicker of fear. He leaned in closer, his breath hitching as he tested the perimeter. Mark did not blink. He did not retreat. He held the ball against his chest, his knuckles white against the leather. The dealer let out a sharp, jagged breath, his jaw tightening until the muscles bulged. He looked at the kids, then back at Mark, his silence curdling into frustration. He saw the immovable line Mark had drawn and realized the leverage was gone. With a sudden, guttural sound, The dealer spat on the gravel at Mark's feet. He turned on his heel, his boots crunching loudly as he retreated toward the street. He did not look back. The alley fell into a profound, ringing silence. The kids stayed where they were, their eyes darting from the departing figure to Mark. The smallest boy stepped forward, then stopped, his gaze lingering on the basketball still clutched in Mark's arms. They looked at him not as a ghost, but as a barrier. The threat had dissolved, leaving only the sound of the wind rattling the chain-link fence. Mark released his grip on the ball and let his shoulders drop. He turned slowly, facing the court, his pulse finally beginning to settle back into a steady, rhythmic thud. The game resumed with a sharp snap of the ball against the asphalt. The boys moved in a blur of motion, their sneakers squeaking against the grit of the court. Mark stood near the sideline, his eyes tracking every pivot and every pass. He blew his whistle, a short, piercing sound that cut through the afternoon air. The kids stopped, reset their positions, and began the drill again. The rhythm was constant, a steady pulse of movement that filled the lot. Then, the sound of the game faded into the background. A shadow fell across the chain-link fence. Mark turned his head. A woman stood at the perimeter, her fingers curled around the metal wire. She was not looking at the gate or the street. She was watching her son. The boy was driving toward the rim, his head down, his focus entirely on the ball. He moved past a defender with a sharp crossover, his feet finding the ground with precision. The woman watched the movement, her gaze tracing the boy's path. She shifted her weight, her eyes moving from the court to the man standing on the sideline. She looked at Mark for a long moment, the distance between them shrinking with every second. She tilted her head. A single, sharp gesture of acknowledgement. Mark held his position, his feet planted, his eyes meeting hers across the wire. The woman walked closer to the gate, the metal latch clicking as she pushed it open. She held out a thermos, the steam rising in a thin gray ribbon against the afternoon light. Mark reached out. He expected the familiar tremor, the small, involuntary vibration that had defined his mornings for years. It did not come. His fingers wrapped around the warm steel, steady and firm. He took the weight of it, his arm holding firm without a shake. She did not speak. She simply turned her attention back to the court, watching her son sprint toward the hoop. Mark unscrewed the cap, the scent of coffee sharp and grounding in the open air. He poured a small amount into the lid and drank, his movements deliberate and calm. The ghosts of the past, the memories of the curb and the empty needle, seemed to recede, pushed back by the immediate, living sound of the game. He turned away from the fence, his gaze settling on the boys. He raised the whistle to his lips and blew, a sharp, clear note that rang out across the lot. The ball hit the asphalt with a rhythmic, heavy thud. He signaled for the next play, and the court erupted in motion, the sound of the game drowning out everything else.